What is fantasy football? Why is it so popular? I was just forced to join a fantasy league in my office and I have no idea where to start. If any of those things ever popped into your head, then you're in the right place. I'm Corey Draper, and I'm here to introduce you to the wonderful world of fantasy football. I'm all about giving you a TLDR version of all things NFL, and these days fantasy football is almost as big as the NFL itself. There's a huge population of people who play it simply because their friends or coworkers forced them to, and they still have no idea what it's all about. So first, I'll give you a rundown of what fantasy football is. Then, against my better judgment, I will reveal to you my top 3 draft strategies, as well as a few resources that helped me win my championship last year, so you can shock all your coworkers by reenacting Super Bowl III. You gotta watch my video on that if you wanna get the joke. So let's get started. So, what is fantasy football? It sounds like something either children or grown men with no life do because they can't play real football. Well, actually, yeah, that's kinda accurate. But it actually is a great supplement to the NFL and makes watching games and following the league even more fun. Basically, fantasy football is a game that is affected by the outcome of what happens in each NFL game. If you decide to play, you're known as an owner and you run your own team. Owners will draft their own team using real-life NFL players. You then earn points for certain statistics that your NFL players achieve week to week. Every week, your team will go head-to-head with another team in your league. The team with the most points wins that week. The teams with the most wins by the last part of the season get into the fantasy playoffs. The team that wins every game in the playoffs wins the championship. Confused yet? Think of it this way. Imagine you're playing Fantasy The Bachelor, and before the season starts, you draft 7 of the girls you think will get the most action. Then every week you get points for certain things that happen in the episode. Like, say you get a point for every time one of your girls cries, or 6 points every time she kisses someone. You're hoping that your girls cry more and kiss more than the girls on the team you're playing every week. So basically, Ashley I would be a player everybody wants on their team. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that, but that's basically the gist. As for the specifics of how a team is structured, every league can be different, but I will give you what makes a common fantasy football roster. A standard roster would consist of 9 starters, 1 quarterback, 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, 1 tight end, 1 flex spot, which can include a wide receiver, running back, or tight end, 1 kicker, and 1 defense/special teams unit. You then would have 8 bench spots. These spots are for your backups. Again, rules vary by league, but typically you can put as many players of any position in these spots. Throughout the season, you will have control over who starts and who sits on the bench. You only get points from your starters, so this is where strategy comes in. You want to play the players you think will score the most points that week based on their talent level and the team they're playing against. You also will be able to drop players off your roster altogether and pick up undrafted free agents during the season. So, if you have a guy who gets hurt or a guy who is underachieving, you can see if there's a better player at that position available. Another fun thing you can do is trade players. If there's a guy you want but he's on another roster, you can offer one or some of your players to that owner in return for the player that you desire. So how do you obtain all these players in the first place? How does it all begin? Your league has a draft before the season. There are 2 common ways in which a league will draft: snake and auction. An auction is exactly what it sounds like. Each owner starts with a certain amount of fake money. When the auction begins, the owners take turns nominating which player to bid on next. They then get into a bidding war for the players they want, and the auction keeps going until everyone's out of money or rosters are filled. A snake draft is the most common draft format, and likely the one that you're in if you're a beginner. In this format, owners take turns choosing the players they want. The order they pick is randomly generated for the first round. The second round then goes in reverse of what the order was in the first round. The third goes back to the original order, and the fourth reverses again, and so on. So the draft order snakes. Get it? Draft day can be the most fun day of the year. There's certainly a strategy to it, and if you want to dominate it, I suggest you do your research. I'll give you some resources later, but first, I'll tell you my top 3 snake draft strategies. Everyone has their own draft strategies that work for them, so these are just suggestions based on my experience. But I've been playing since 2003, so that's a lot of experience. That's not cool, is it? The first rule I have is never, under any circumstances, draft a kicker until the very last round. This is a mistake I even see hardcore fantasy players make. Kickers are rarely game-changing, and the difference between the top kicker in the league and the 12th kicker in the league is rarely that big. Instead, draft a kicker in the last round, wait about 3 weeks into the season, and then check on free agents to see if there's a better one. There's almost always a top 5 kicker just sitting there because no one thinks to look for a kicker after the season starts. Number 2, don't reach for a defense. You can probably wait until the last 3 rounds to draft a defense. Again, this is something you can keep an eye on in the free agent pool. And finally, number 3, which may surprise some people, don't reach for a quarterback. This obviously depends on your league format, but in most leagues, you can wait to find a very good quarterback in the 10th round who will be serviceable for you throughout the year. Yeah, you will miss out on guys like Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees who will put up consistently monster numbers, but there are also usually some solid QB free agents available if yours doesn't pan out. You're better off stocking your bench with running backs and wide receivers who get you the real points. So those are my draft strategies. Do you have any yourself? Let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you're new to this and thinking you want to get serious and try to win your league and completely surprise your friends and coworkers, here are my very own go-to resources for fantasy football. They have helped me reach the playoffs every year I've used them and helped me win a championship last season. I really don't want to reveal these to the world, especially my league mates, so hopefully they're not watching. Real quick disclaimer, I'm not getting paid for any of this. Every resource I'm mentioning has no stake in this video. I'm pretty sure none of them know I exist, which may change if they finally respond to my my letters. The first resource is the Fantasy Footballers. They have a daily podcast, an active website with rankings and articles, and even their own community of fantasy football players across the world who can answer questions about who to start, trade possibilities, and overall strategy. I cannot recommend the Footballers enough. Their podcast is hilarious and super informative. The best part is they're completely independent. They're not owned by a conglomeration like ESPN or CBS. They're everyday Joes like you and me. They also go against the grain and give you insight you don't get elsewhere. You can check them out on YouTube too. I'll link to their channel below. The second resource that has been super valuable to me is Reddit. The fantasy football subreddit has a great community of fantasy football players and is a great resource for news and strategy. There's a thread created every day just for asking questions about who to start that week. It's a great place to go in a pinch because you know you'll get a response quickly. I'll also link to that site below. If you're not familiar with Reddit, be sure to read all the posting rules and guidelines before jumping in. They kind of get anal about that stuff. And lastly, my favorite app for fantasy football related news, SleeperBot. This is a fantastic app that gives you a notification every time there's big news that hits. It's especially useful the morning of game days because it'll notify you if a player has been surprisingly cut or ruled out for the game. All 3 of these resources have been pivotal in carrying me to the playoffs the last few years, and now I have bestowed them upon you, unless you're in a league with me, in which case, don't listen to me. Do you have any go-to resources? What are your fantasy football strategies? I want to hear it all. Let's help each other here. Also, feel free to ask questions. I encourage all fantasy players to chime in and help the newbies here. Thanks for watching, guys, and remember to subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to follow The Play Reaction on Twitter and Instagram so you can get updates, explanations, and reactions on NFL news as it hits. See you later.